Hello, this is Bill Moreland with Bankrate Data. I'm a little tardy on doing a video. I was going to probably end up doing one this week on KeyBank with all the news they've had, and I've had some observations with Key for a number of months. And then I got an email this morning from the American Banker. I don't have a subscription, but I'm on their alerts, their daily briefing, and there was an article in here on how First Citizens became the top performing big bank. So I'm always entertained by these. And so I was curious. I don't have the ability to look at their article, but I wanted to go in and take a look at their call report to get a feel for if I can understand, one, what they're doing, and then two, if there's an explanation, right? Would I agree with this from a qualitative or analytical perspective? This is not a commentary on American Banker. I see these articles all over the place. I'm sure there's got to be some ranking mechanism that they're using, whether it's income, customer service, some quantitative, some qualitative. I often get this question, could you review all the banks and rank order them? I'm not a big fan of that. I definitely think it's a fool's gold because it's a lot more complex. If you take a couple of metrics and you analyze them, of course you can get a rank ordered list, but it's a lot more complicated and nuanced. Why a bank may be performing well could be worrisome. And why a bank is not performing well may not be something that is a big concern. Asset mix, funding costs, yields, government guarantees. There's all kinds of things, a plethora of things that will explain away performance. So let's go ahead and take a quick look in here at First Citizens Bank. First thing we see here in the upper right is their assets, right? So we had the Silicon Valley Bank acquisition in 2023 Q1, which was very beneficial because they got a fairly large available line of credit from the FDIC, and they had some loss share agreements. And what ends up happening, if you go back, and I'm old enough to remember the last cycle, kind of the last two cycles, I should say, banks that acquire often have the ability to throw the kitchen sink in, right? So we're not performing as well, but that all kind of gets blended away. Not suggesting that's the case, but these can be very beneficial. We also see the CIT acquisition just a year earlier. So we've gone from a $58 billion bank to a $220 billion bank very, very quickly. So what we're going to do is we're going to cycle down here and look, first thing when you come in and look at a bank, look at the tools that we have built that analyze and try to make this a passive-based system. So instead of having to go look at 600 odd metrics and find what the story is, we've built a series of 3 tools. The first one here is an old tear sheet, and it's 54 metrics, and it's organized into capitalization, liquidity, net interest margin, income and expense, asset quality, and charge-offs. So the color coding here is bottom 20% and top 50% of all U.S. banks. So really what you're looking for is not so much the shading and the graying, but what's blue, what's orange, right? And so we see their capitalization. And once again, I'm going to be looking at the call report data. This is the depository. It's not going to be the entire entity. It's not going to tie to GAAP. A lot of the analytics will be similar, but some things will be a little bit different because it's the majority, but it's a subsidiary of just the depository or the call report data. Most notably, we see almost no securities losses. The mark-to-market losses are 6.5 cents on the dollar, and their securities losses to mark-to-market losses to Tier 1 capital is almost negligible at 11%. Of course, that's Silicon Valley, right? So that was, of course, they're not going to carry that over. And then we come down here and we see a couple of things firing in core deposits, insured deposits. I'm less uptight about insured deposits on the larger banks. Sometimes it can be problematic, but more often than not, it's not. Those relationships or those commercial relationships are often a lot stickier. What we are seeing is some funding deposit stuff here, but I'm not too upset about that. But man, oh man, look at the blue on the net interest margin. So that is a very, very high number. And that's basically generating a really good income number down here as well. And we see that they're very, very efficient. Efficiency ratio is low at 55. We're starting to see a little bit of hint of issues in asset quality, charge-offs, coverage ratio. That's going to be reserves. So let's pop down a little bit more and we'll take a look at the bottom, which is the threshold alerts. So I'm going to skip Century and come back to that momentarily. The threshold alerts are looking at 88 metrics and looking for things that are extreme. So if you're a major alert, chances are you're in the bottom 5 to 10% nationally on that metric. If you're a minor alert, it's going to be in the 7 to 15, 10 to 15 kind of percentage range. So we see, not unlike a lot of banks right now, their non-owner occupied NPLs are very elevated at 5.08%. Sentry is a system that analyzes 125 asset quality metrics, and it looks for significant or material. And material is a trick, because what's material for a big bank and what's material for a small bank, obviously the heuristics and the rules have to be modified for that. But what it's looking for is material or significant changes quarter over quarter on 125 metrics. And so what we're seeing here is early stage delinquencies and late stage delinquencies. We're starting to see some increasing levels there, as well as C&I restructures or modifications. So we'll come back to this. But what I wanted to do is basically modify, and down here at the bottom, you see we have two peer groups, national and yellow. That's our default 99. And we are actually using the UBPR Peer 1 group here. It's not always going to be exact. We make some modifications for people that have extreme ratios. But basically, this is probably a little bit better peer group than our default 99. The large bank peer groups for the UBPR are actually pretty good, pretty strong. Not always going to be perfect, but no peer group is. Typically, when you get into peer groups beyond the top banks, we tend to recommend using ours, which are more done on asset size. But you have the ability to toggle to either. And so what we're looking at here is we're going to come in and we're going to take a quick look in income and expense. And we're going to come over here to pre-tax net operating income, and we're going to do tax equivalent. And so this is probably the best pre-tax measure of income on the call report. And what we see down here is a huge spike, right? Well, that's going to be the Silicon Valley merger. So we'll set that aside because there was a lot of accounting going on, law shares, all kinds of stuff. And we're going to pop down, we're going to take a look at this percentage. And once again, we're looking at the UBPR1, Uniform Bank Peer Report. And we see that the number is elevated. I realize the scale's a little off, but if we come down here and look, we see 191, 133, 190, 182. And the peers down at the bottom are going to be 28 other large banks. And what we see is they rank extremely high, right? Northern Trust, Goldman Sachs, Morgan, those are all quasi-banks, quasi-not banks. But First Citizens is kind of one of the true pure play banks in the group, actually ranks probably the highest, right? JP Morgan's not even a pure play bank. But whether you include them or not include them, First Citizens is ranking 1 or 2 among the largest banks on the ratio. A couple of things, however. One, you'll see this drop to 717 million or 1.33%. You also see a drop to in the peers where the other 28 banks dropped as well. Don't worry about that. That was an FDIC one-off assessment for all the largest banks. So really, you kind of have to ignore that 133. But what we are seeing is a 190, 190, and then a slight dip, right? So remember this in the back of your mind. Their numbers are extremely high, but they're actually kind of starting to trend down a little bit. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, what is driving this pre-tax net operating income? And my guess is this is probably what American Banker's using as a series of metrics. And this is probably one of the main drivers, probably not the only one, but it's going to be, if a bank is profitable, that's well performing. So we're going to come down and say, look, a main driver of this is going to be net interest margin. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a toggle. There's 8 different metrics, which I loathe as an analyst because it's confusing to know which one's the right one. Typically what banks will look at is a tax equivalent basis, right? So they're going to, whatever securities holdings that may be tax exempt, they've got to make some adjustments. This is going to be the cleanest, fairest, quote unquote, way to look at it. About 30% of our bank activity will come on average assets. About 70 will come on average earning assets. So it's taking out REO or any of the other asset types that don't actually earn income. So this is going to be the most generous, right? This is going to be the tax equivalent basis and average earning assets. And frankly, when I say generous, I don't mean it's skewing the numbers to be beneficial in a way that they're not. No, this probably is the best way to look at this, but it's also going to result in the highest as well. So scrolling down here, we basically see 407, 385, 363, 360. So now you start to see they were performing incredibly well. I mean, 407 basis points when peers are at 296 is remarkable, right? But they are starting to come down, and that's dribbling into, if we go back and remember, the pre-tax net operating income was high and now is starting to dip down a little bit. So clearly there's a mechanism that we're headed towards talking about here. But if we scroll down, once again, we see that the net interest margin out of the 28, 29 banks in UBPR1, they rank really, really well, right? So we know Capital One and Ally are going to be big consumer banks. So once again, no peer group is perfect. But Regions shows very well in here as well as M&T. But any way you stack it up, First Citizens doing a great job of generating income, and that's primarily driven by their very high net interest margin. So now let's start breaking down what is the mechanism behind this, right? So I'm going to take a look at liquidity, and I'm going to go take a look at core deposits. Once again, we see the big jumps in the CIT and the Silicon Valley acquisition. And actually, we see they've done a pretty good job of growing core deposits. That's good performance, especially post-merger. There's often, you see a little bit of rundown there, but even that is not a big rundown. Normally, you have rundown after mergers. Now, part of it is their footprints are different, perhaps. But they've done a good job. So they must be paying grandma, as I like to put it, which is going to be your retail and commercial deposits, reasonably well. Let's go take a look at brokered deposits, right? And so brokered deposits are going to be those deposits that are coming either through Schwab or Fidelity type of account, or they're coming from institutional money. They do have quite a bit, but $4 or $5 billion for a bank of this size at 2% is not a terribly lot. And that's typically because they're doing a good job of core deposits, right? So we're going to come into liabilities, and we're going to take a look at FHLB advances. All right. So we see leading up to Silicon Valley. Remember, this is pre-Silicon Valley. We see that those numbers were going up, and they were starting to dip into this liquidity pool available, this funding available to them. But not at really high levels. And now it's gone, right? Absolutely gone. Zero. Zero is zero. And if we come down and we look, there's not a lot of other banks at zero. And realistically, Morgan Stanley Private Bank, and Bank of New York Mellon, they're not going to be taken. So they are extremely unique in not having any FHLB advances for banks their size. And why? Well, because they probably don't need it, right? And why do they not need it? Because they got $36 billion of funding, liquidity, from some other borrowed entity. And this is not going to be FHLB borrowed. That's going to be unique. It's going to be separate. The timing of this would lead you to believe it's potentially BTFP, right? A huge, massive increase in that same quarter. I don't think that's what's going on here. If you look at their press releases, I believe this is their available line of credit from the FDIC. And so this is enormous, right? It's 17% of total assets. The highest in the country for banks their size, by far, double, right? So now all of a sudden we start to get a feel for what their funding model is. And so we're going to make a copy of this, put it over here on the left side, and we're going to just keep that there, $36 billion. So what are they paying on this money? Not much. Go to funding data and go to trading and other. Now that's going to be trading, other borrowed money, including FHLB. But we've already established they don't have any FHLB. So when I click on it, lo and behold, I see 36 billion, 36 billion, 36 billion in the denominator, 36 billion, 36 billion, 36 billion. So we have an exact identifier of what they're paying on this money, this line of credit from the FDIC, which is exceptionally generous. So as we get excited about their pre-tax net operating income, and as we get excited about their net interest margin, they have an advantage. They have an unbelievably good advantage, almost to the point where it's corporate welfare. Come down, no one is even close, right? Ally Bank at 397, and everybody else is paying 5-6% on external money, or FHLB trading or other borrowed. So this really isn't fair, right? I mean, we could say that this bank is a high performer, but I imagine every bank in America would be a high performer if they could get the ability to get funding at that level, which is 200 basis points. So now the question becomes, when does this money have to be given back, right? And I don't know. I've not gone in. I've not looked. BTFP money has to be paid back in March of 2025. So any bank that's got a large chunk of that is basically got a cliff, right? There's going to have to be something that happens to replace that money. I don't know when this line of credit disappears, but for as long as they have it, every other bank in America is at a disadvantage to this when it comes to performance. All right. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at their asset mix. We've looked at the liabilities, where their funding is coming from. And what I like to look at is essentially, what are they doing, right? So we see cash at $26 billion, 11% of assets, 12%, and peers are at 13. So a little bit lower. Securities portfolio is much smaller. Of course, it helps when Silicon Valley had to liquidate their securities portfolio. And loans and leases are at 62, which is $138 billion. All right, so what we're going to do is pop into cash, and we see that their cash numbers went way high. And part of that is they got $36 billion, which coincidentally, $36 billion plus $5 billion is like $41 billion. So, okay, we got money from the FDIC and a line of credit. And it looks like a big chunk of it went to the Fed. Right there. Like, you could almost argue almost all of it. Now, they would always have some money at the Fed, as evidenced by, the 4.74 billion pre all this. And so we got a pretty good idea that they're parking the money at the Fed. All right. Just like we looked at funding costs, I can look at yield. And I know they're sitting at 24, 29, $30 billion. So if I come into yield, which is interest income, and I go to balances due, I see numbers that are very, very close right there. So these are a 2-quarter average. This is from schedule RCK. That's a 2-quarter average. So 27, 28 is going to be the average of those two. 29, 32 is going to be close to that average of 30, right? Depends upon the timing, but it's close enough. I mean, this makes up 90-some% of the total number. And they're yielding at the IOR, interest rate on reserve balances, 5.45%. So right out of the gate, we have a real good understanding for why this bank is making so much money and why they're such a great performer. So the question is, right, that's not apples to apples. These guys are clearly getting a benefit that other people are not getting. And I would argue, why are they still, what's the point of a line of credit? When does it end, right? It's a bridge. It shouldn't be an ongoing thing. But once again, during times of stress, big banks that are saddled, and I don't think it's saddled, I think they're happy to enter in these relationships because they got the power during the negotiating, right? I mean, I'm not a fly on the wall. I don't know. But this is a pretty good deal, right? So the American banker is not wrong in saying that they're a high performer, but I'm not overly impressed, right? Much of that incremental, above and beyond extraordinary performance is not necessarily a banking franchise, right? This is just beneficial funding costs and beneficial yield and interest income. So just to give you an idea, let's go back to this and do yield. And we're going to do balance due, and we see it's $378 million. Now, one could argue that there is a funding cost associated with this if they basically are funding it from the line of credit, which you could draw a line. That is what they're doing. But money's fungible, right? And so if we come in and we take a look, I could make a pretty good argument that it's all income. So we're going to come over here, and this is a hat tip to one of our clients. He's like, this story, and he's like, well, take a look at their interest-bearing deposits. And I'm like, actually, that's very clever. So every bank's got interest-bearing deposits, and every bank has non-interest-bearing deposits. The non-interest-bearing deposits here are $40 billion. So you can make a real good argument that is 100% income. There is no funding cost associated because money is fungible and it's just this big pool. So worst case, they're paying, 3.6, 3.7. Best case, they're paying nothing. So that 400 million is straight income with virtually nothing out there encumbering it. So if we come to income and expense, we go to pre-tax net operating, we come in here and look at the 999, that's like 36, 37%. And the quarter before, it was like 44%. So this bank is extremely over-reliant on things that have nothing to do with their ability to be, look, I'm not knocking it. If I wish I was in their spot. We don't have the luxury. Not every bank, not hardly any banks have the luxury, but you could make a real argument that this bank is not that profitable when you take out all these these extra deals that they're getting to take advantage of. So let's go ahead and close this down. And kind of to keep, going back to what we were talking about a little bit before, is let's take a look at the banking franchise. So I'm going to go back to Century, and we're just going to start cycling through. So what do we see? Well, we see their non-owner occupied portfolio is just getting more and more and more higher in terms of non-performing delinquencies. Come into multifamily. These kind of fluctuate around a little bit, but we're seeing a $10 million increase. Look what we're seeing with construction. So construction's firing. CRE owner occupied is firing. We're seeing an increase once again in multifamily. Come to other events, and we're seeing a very large increase in C&I. So we're going to cycle in. We're going to look at loans 2012. We're going to see that their portfolio has not grown. So they're making money hand over fist, right? One of the highest performing banks in the country, and they don't want to lend. But why would you? Why wouldn't you just sit there and keep the money parked at the Fed? So, why are banks lending? Well, banks aren't lending because the Fed doesn't want them to lend, right? If the Fed wanted them to lend, they wouldn't be paying 5.4. Now, I don't think that's the entire story, but that certainly is part of the motivation. So why lend? Especially if it's 540 basis points of income, right? Why lend? Why go through the structure? Why go through the cost? Why go through the risk? Why? There's no reason to. So that will change as interest rates fall. Inevitably, we're going to see this dynamic of their extraordinary income is going to start coming back to what everyone else's income is, right? This is a one-off series of things that they're able to take advantage of. So let's cycle in and take a look at early stage delinquencies. There's their total loans compared to other banks. Let's go back to UBPR1, still doing very well. But we are starting to see that they are firing red in a number of portfolios. We're seeing the construction land portfolio start to become more delinquent, but we saw that early from Century. We're seeing C&I stay elevated. We're basically seeing CRE owner occupied is starting to degrade. And we see a couple other portfolios, but to be fair, they're smaller. Non-performing loans. All right, let's start cycling. What do we see? Well, we see C&I is extremely elevated. As a percentage, it's starting to come down, but not tremendously. Their lending has gone up a little bit, but yeah, they're getting a reduction in the dollar amount, so the percentage is shedding. Let's take a look at the CRE non-owner occupied portfolio. This one is starting to accelerate, and it's gray because everybody is accelerating in this portfolio, right? There's nothing here that's unique, but bad is still bad. And we see their 10-year performance in this portfolio, they're considerably higher. Are they taking charge-offs in this portfolio? No. Are they potentially delaying charge-offs? Yes, but if we take a look at this, the scale is going to be very odd. So I beg your indulgence. This is a ratio that measures for every dollar of charge-offs in a portfolio, how many non-performing loans are working their way through the system. Lower is better. By far low is better because it means that bank is dealing with it. So what we see here is that they are in the $17, $18, $15 range, and then it skyrocketed to 39. This bank is delaying charge-offs. That's clearly what they're doing. So maybe they can get away with it, but if we put every bank out there, and where's that 39 rank on UBPR1? One of the, down in the bottom half, bottom third. Some of these banks don't even have CRE portfolios, right? So they are clearly likely going to have to start booking some charge-offs. Now, are they hiding it in REO? Not hiding it, but is it moving into REO? Because you could take a zero charge-off and the money moves into REO. Nope, that's not what we're seeing, right? 50 million, 50 million, 50 million. But they have elevated REO, very elevated REO, right? Here's the banks down here at the bottom. They're going to have to liquidate that. And why aren't they liquidating it? And the reason is they're probably going to take losses on it, right? So you come into non-interest income, you do liquidations on REO sales. They've refused to liquidate their REO in commercial real estate. And there's a good chance that you're going to start seeing some negative numbers. And I think they probably do a fair job. You see some negatives, you see some positives. They're never going to evaluate it exactly to the penny. And plus time changes, right? If it's sitting there for a couple of months or a half a year, the valuation could either go up or go down. And that's what would generate those plus and minuses. But I'm going to guess they're going to start having to book some of those liquidations. I would think they would be better off doing it earlier rather than later, but that's not always going to be the case. So coming in here, we basically do see NPLs are creeping up, and we see their C&I portfolio NPLs are extremely elevated, but they're not getting worse. Well, are they? So if we come into the modifications and we look at the performing, remember, Century told us this. So in the back of our minds, we knew they were restructuring a ton of commercial and industrial debt. And what we see is it's all performing, right? So they're reporting $506 million of delinquencies. That's right there. 506, 1.4%. So it looks like delinquencies are going down. Modifications, performing. We see, however, they've restructured $265 million and it just goes up and goes up and goes up. It's a gateway drug. Once you start doing it, it becomes a way to manage your delinquencies. So they're reporting 140 basis points of stress, but in reality, they're actually sitting much higher at 213 basis points of stress when you add in delinquencies plus those performing modifications. Is it horrible? No, not all that. But what we're seeing here is they kind of had a really great window of 3 to 4 quarters that's likely not going to be replicated moving forward. Clearly, the dynamics are going to change if interest rates go to zero. They may still have this line of credit that's very beneficial and unfairly beneficial. You would argue if you're an other outside bank not getting that. And we're starting to see delinquencies. And let's come in, let's take a look at assets. And the last piece to this puzzle is, are they well reserved? No. We're basically seeing they were at 184. So this is for every dollar of allowance or reserves, how many dollars of adjusted NPLs, adjusted for any government guarantees, are working its way through the system. So higher is clearly better. But we basically see 184, then it bumps down to 176, 179, then it bumps down to 150, and it bumps down to 139. Meanwhile, their adjusted NPLs have gone up every single quarter. So they're not as well reserved as they should be. They're not as well reserved as they were just a few quarters ago. And that's because they're keeping provision low, right? Provision is lower. And so one of the reasons they got a better income number is they're not setting enough aside for reserves. And if we really come in and take a look at what they're doing with their TDRs, or their loan modifications, the number is considerably lower. They've gone from $1.67 to $1.24 to $1.08 to $1.03. And so they're getting to the point where they're not extremely well reserved. They're in the bottom of this group, right? The bottom third. So I'm not denigrating the performance, but I'm not sure that I would classify this performance as being spectacular, right? Some of these things any bank could do well if they had the benefits that they did. And we're starting to clearly see a degradation in their asset quality where they're going to start booking some more losses. All right. I appreciate your time. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out and give me a call. Thank you.